you looking for clever methods to address complex problems? Do you need ways to make predictions, determine probability, or minimize risks? If you do, then you're in the right place. Welcome to our podcast that we call Smart Remarks, Howarth States. Now here are your hosts, Christian Smart and Doug Howarth.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where you are in the world. Welcome to Smart Remarks, Howarth States. I'm Doug Howarth, and with me today, my longtime friend and co-host, Dr. Christian Smart. Christian, hi.
Hey, hi, Doug.
How are you today?
I'm doing well. How are you?
Pretty good. First things first, I understand the audio component of your new book is finally out for the masses. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so there's an audio book. It's 9.5 hours of recorded material that is based on my book. It's the audio version. It was produced by Recorded Books, narrated by Barry Abrams. So that is out now. It's available. If you have not checked out my book, and either the hardcover ebook version, the audio version is the cheapest, and less than $20. If you're an Audible subscriber, you can get it for right now for less than $8.
Oh, great. Excellent. Well, again, ladies and gentlemen, I've read the book twice and I really enjoy it. It's very instructive. And the world just saw, especially here locally, about, I'd say maybe 50 miles that way is the Port of Los Angeles from where I'm sitting here. And we had a little event out there this week that kind of points up Christian's ideas on risk coming to light. There's as some of you may know, there's a global supply chain problem. The supply chains now are kind of overwhelmed at some bottlenecks, one of which is the Port of Los Angeles and Port of Long Beach. And we can't get enough of the containers through, so the container ships are stacking up further and further from shore, going out to sea. And what we also have offshore here in California are oil refineries, oil docks, rather, I should say, oil rigs. And there is a pipeline running from one of those refineries back to shore. And what appears to have happened was a German vessel, a German cargo ship, dropped anchor. The anchor went down, either struck directly the pipeline, or then as the ship dropped anchor and started to slow down, that anchor dragged the pipeline several tens of feet and ripped it apart. And so we had an oil spill out here. So Christian, our readers would wonder, well, what can we do for something like that? I mean, it almost seems like a black swan event. How would you characterize that?
A little bit of a black swan in the sense that it was unexpected. I mean, but it's not necessarily something that could be unprecedented. It may be hard to quantify because it probably has happened in relatively few number of times before. So it's probably not something expected, but it's something that we should, in terms of managing risk and looking at risk, we need to expand the scope and not just look at the rearview mirror and look at what's happened in the past. We need to imagine what could go wrong in the future. And so as more and more of these ships stack up, the chances of an anchor hitting a pipeline was going to increase. So it's the kind of thing that I think would not be a black swan in the sense that you could see this coming. Something that you could see coming. But it requires some imagination, and you need to look beyond just what's happened in the past, is what could go wrong in the future. And that's one of the things that did not occur in the management of this risk.
Well, what's also interesting too, and of course, anytime there's a disaster like this, there's the pointing of fingers at who did what when, and the pipelines being taken to task because they didn't report it quickly enough, and they didn't react as fast as some people would have wanted. It took something in the order of 3 hours to shut the pipeline down. But then again, how often do you expect your pressure to start to drop off and make an instant recognition that the problem is because the thing ripped apart, right? So I guess you can't maybe, well, you should have a pipeline map that people have, and I'm supposing that they have that, but maybe they didn't. I mean, right now in local areas here, if you want to dig, they have signs up. Gas pipeline here, electrical cables here, power lines here. Imagine you have that in. Well, do you have all overhead lines where you are? You must have some things underground. And
No, we have a lot of underground. So if any time that you want to do any digging, dig up of any length, any extent, like in your front yard, you have to call the gas company.
Right.
Mainly the gas company is the major concern. Electric
Right.
company, and they'll come out and they'll spray paint your yard where the lines are, so you can make sure you avoid them.
Excellent. Well, they can't really spray paint the ocean, but they could create a map. And then, of course, when you're dropping anchor and you've got currents, there's even something as heavy as an anchor gets some drift on it. So you'd have to make a special kind of map, I think, for pipelines underneath the areas in front of the ports, because we just saw we had a pretty big disaster here. So I don't know if that exists. That would be interesting to note that.
Yep.
When you go into a dock, you see all you've got the maritime maps that show you where the depths are at every place, and which means the pipeline ought to be there someplace, but nobody's going to be calculating drift, I think, on the current to show where you could drop the anchor in. And there must be some sort of drift component in there, wouldn't there? I mean, seems like that would be likely.
Yeah, it seems like there would be some sort of you could maybe create some sort of rule where you would not drop within a certain number of feet of the pipeline.
Yes, right.
I would account for that. Right.
They're trying to rein it in now, and then you probably can't have something on every pipeline, but you could have a more. I mean, we do have oil leaks from time to time, and we probably need a quick reaction force for oil leaks. Alabama's got it's got a pretty short coastline, doesn't it? I mean, it's.
Yes, pretty short. Yes, it's a couple of counties, and then there's Florida on one side, and then
Mississippi on the other. Right. Well, the whole idea of coastlines are kind of interesting too. From Mandelbrot, how long is the coastline, right?
Yes. The more you zoom in, the longer it gets. Yeah.
I was writing on my LinkedIn page the other day about taking a risk on likening how ships have to navigate and then how markets have to navigate. And so getting back to what the topic was, is that the Ariane AS2, which was a business jet that was in development as recently as just a few months ago, wanted to sell 300 of these units at $120 million a piece in the course of 10 years. And my analysis showed that it's worth all of $120 million. That wasn't the problem. They had the price right. But what they didn't expect, or they didn't allow for, is that there is a demand frontier that actually cuts off how much you can have. And it's like going into the shoreline on the water. You can get pretty close to shore and not hit a rock, but every once in a while there'll be an obstacle you don't see. So the Costa Concordia back in, I think it was 2012, was going too close to an island off the coast of Italy, and they ran aground when they hit a rock that was 8 meters below the surface. And very interestingly, this gets back to one of your points that you've been making, and a point of mine, is that the captain in this case had turned off a bunch of his navigation instruments. He needed glasses, but he didn't bring them to the bridge. So he was having his first officer check the radar and the sonar for him. And he turned off the nav aids because he said, well, he knew the water's like the back of his hand, and he didn't feel any problem, that he would have a problem there. And haven't you seen this happen time and time again, Christian, in your
Yes.
experience? I mean, people just think they know better than anybody else, right? And then they get themselves in trouble.
Yeah, as far back as the Titanic, the captain of the Titanic before the fateful voyage said he had never been in an accident, never seen any accidents. Accidents were a thing of the past.
Did he actually say that the accidents were a thing of the past?
Well, I mean,
That's crazy.
it's kind of
or effectively said that, yeah.
effectively saying that he had
Yeah.
never been in any sort or any big magnitude. So it seemed like I think he believed he was overconfident in his own skills, and he believed that with modern shipbuilding that there wouldn't be any more problems like that.
Right. Yeah. For those of you who watched the series Billions, there was a risk event in the series Billions. For those of you who don't watch, I enjoy it. It's a series that's about this billionaire, Bobby Axelrod, who's got a fund called Axe Capital. And he's always trading jabs and barbs and trying to get either himself out of trouble or into trouble with this longtime prosecutor and adversary. And then he's got another rival billionaire that he's going up against. And so by some form of trickery, Mr. Axelrod was duped into taking monies that he shouldn't have taken. And so now he's going to be subject to an arrest. And without spoiling it for you, I'm hoping maybe if you do watch the series, maybe turn this part off of the recording. But if you don't, what he did was he wants to get away from this potential lawsuit, and it shows him rolling up to a private airport. He's in the New York City area, so call it Teterboro, something on Long Island. So he rolls off to this private airport, and he's there with one of his guys, and he's looking off at this business jet, and it's set up for cargo. And said, I remember when I was looking at this thing 3 or 4 years ago, I said, do I really need a third business jet for cargo just for cases of an emergency? And then this guy said, well, this is the upper corner of the risk register here. You've got a really highly improbable event with really drastic consequences that requires a lot of money to solve it. And so our solution here is we're actually going to put you in this cargo jet. We'll put you in a cargo container that has air in it, and we're going to pass you right through customs. And he did it. And the next thing you see him is that he's being whisked off to Switzerland, and the Swiss come up to the plane, with an armed guard, and you think it's the end for Bobby Axelrod, and this official next to the armed guard, hands him a passport. He looks at the passport, he hands it to the armed guard, and he said, okay, come on in. And he's in Switzerland. But, that's what did he spend to get around that problem? I mean, he's got himself a $60 million jet that he only gets very occasional use out of. And so the point being that for Mr. Axelrod, this was a black swan event, but he had some contingencies in place to extricate himself from that. And he might have gone his whole life without needing something like this. Or you might have, in a world kind of view, you might go through several lifetimes never needing a specific kind of way to protect yourself from something like that. And but then when you do need it, you've got to have a way to handle it. Now Christian here is worked in the Missile Defense Agency for years. Then he's come out. He does a lot of work for NASA. And we've seen a lot of these movies where there's some asteroid or comet that's going to hit the Earth and wipe us out. There was the couple of movies with Billy Bob Thornton back in, what was that one in?
Armageddon,
yeah. And then very recently there was Greenland with Gerald Butler. And we have some technologies that we could use to deflect large incoming objects. And I know NASA took a stab at that. I think it was early this year. There was a team that tried to figure out how far out we would need to have an object before we could work on it. I guess the big fear there is that if the object comes out of from our angle is the sun, it's going to be kind of hard to find it. What's your understanding of what we're doing there?
Yeah, some of those we don't know about because of the sun, and they do revise the odds. There is a big one that's out there that I think that's the size of a large building. A little bit concerned about, and the odds of it hitting the Earth have been revised upward to it's 1 in several thousand. I mean that's
right.
Not it. That's not very negligible. I mean that could definitely happen.
Right. And of course, if its orbit gets perturbed a little bit, it could increase the odds further still, right?
Right.
So so imagine you were running an agency like that to say we want to both be able to detect these things further out and have more reaction time, and then more tools at our disposal for us to be able to deflect the big rock. What would you do in that situation there?
I think spend more money. It might be even worth putting some sort of planetary spacecraft in place so that you could see things coming from behind the sun.
Right.
Things coming from behind the sun. Put it in the other. Put it in maybe an Earth trailing orbit, but so that it's on the other side of the sun from us.
Right.
That's one possibility. Something that would try to detect that, and then some money really on trying to deflect these things. Do a prototype and go out and take something that's very small and shift its orbit and see what it would take to do that. Because nothing's been done. It's a pretty low probability that we're going to have a dinosaur-like asteroid strike, but who knows? I mean, if it could, and if it does, then we're really in bad shape. So it would be worth spending billions of dollars on something like that to protect the future of the human race.
So now, as I think about it, just doing it from a real high level perspective, if it was exactly behind the sun, trailing us by 182 and a half days, then you'd have a signal problem. So you probably need to have two.
Yeah, right. So
you one 120 degrees ahead and 120 degrees behind.
Yeah.
And then as the planet and the two satellites go about, then they have some both triangulation and a bigger sweep of the sky.
Yeah.
So see, we just doubled the cost of the project, Christian. We just started out.
Well, I mean, it's not really double the cost because you're some amount of fixed costs in developing, and you probably won't need one satellite design. But yeah,
there you go. We're on a learning curve there, Christian. Yeah, we don't have to do all the development twice. But I've heard several times that they've the people that track the near Earth objects will see something they hadn't seen before, and when that happens, most of the time, if it's sufficiently large, it's usually coming from our angle out of the sun, and which tells me that your idea to have these trailing and advancing satellites online would be, well, potentially the difference between having a high risk event be catastrophic and not having the high risk event.
Because if you look at there's a book titled "The Ends of the World," and basically the world as it was known at that time has ended. I think it's 5 different times in different periods, and the end of what most people think about and know about is the end of the Cretaceous period,
right?
Large asteroid strike that wiped out the dinosaurs,
right?
And so that has happened before. I mean, that's something that we do. There is historical precedent, so that is a risk worth paying attention to. Others have involved climate change. We know climate change is currently ongoing.
Right.
We don't know what the consequences are long term because it's a nonlinear phenomenon. It's really hard to predict what the consequences of climate change are, but we know that it could be really bad.
Yes, and then you have these rare events that happen. The explosion at Krakatoa, I think I believe it was 1814. I don't know if I got the year right, but
yeah, it was a long time ago.
It basically exploded, and the world had what was known as the year without a summer, because so much debris went up into the atmosphere that it blotted out the sun for the largest portion of the year, and then crops failed, and that induced a climate change right then and there. So it's hard to figure what you're going to be up against, but I mean, the point that I've always taken from your work is that we have to make some sort of allowance for that. And it seems like we've made very little allowance for it. It's that corner of the distribution is very expensive to populate it to get something that's going to help you. But the consequence on this can be oh wait, it could be the end of the world, right? So
Yeah, we need to prepare against the really bad consequences. We need to put something in place, regardless of the likelihood, regardless of how low we think the likelihood is. We need to prepare for the really bad events and make ourselves so that we're resilient when these bad things do occur, and bad things will occur, that it doesn't wipe us out.
right now, what's your favorite example of where somebody saw or anticipated, or either reacted to or anticipated a high risk event, and then they fended one off in subsequent years? Do you have a couple of examples where somebody did that?
Here's an example of decision making under uncertainty, where if you look at it in retrospect, the result may not have been the best result given what happened or given the situation, but it was the best decision to make. So the film Dirty Harry, he's now 50 years old. So there's this Dirty Harry, that played by the Clint Eastwood. He's kind of a road cop. He has a shootout with bank robbers in the street, and there's one bank robber left, and he's lying down. He's been wounded, and he's lying down, and his gun is within reach, but Dirty Harry is standing up and is approaching him, and he's pointing his gun at him, and he says, "I know what you're thinking. Did he fire 6 shots or only 5?" Well, to be honest, and all this excitement, I've kind of lost track myself. But you got to ask yourself one question, punk. Do you feel lucky? Well, do you? And so he surrenders. Now, Dirty Harry then pulls the trigger, and revealing that his gun is actually empty. But given that he wasn't sure what the consequences were,
right,
he could and go to jail and live in there a day, or he could have his head blown off by the most powerful handgun in the world, a 44 Magnum. He probably made the wise choice.
Yeah, he did. He took the one that avoided the drastic consequence. But it seems to me that what we always do here is we avoid the choices that seem too unlikely to happen, and that we don't put enough money towards it. And then it's something as simple here as bridge building. For example, here in California, the roads are getting clogged, and so what's happening is we're having a lot of freeway improvements. When I noticed up in small town I used to live up in Palmdale, that somebody very cleverly up there at a couple of bridge abutments decided to extend the support for the bridge past the 2 lanes that it had inward, so that you could add another lane should that other lane ever be needed. Well, the cost to do that while you're working on the project is not inconsequential, but it's a tiny fraction of what it costs to do it from scratch. I think we've probably seen that over and over again. You must have seen that happen in the military field a couple of times, I would think.
Oh, yes. Yeah. So, and that's one of the issues with doing things right up front for longer term. So in the military, the operations sustainment of a weapon system is by far the largest part of the logical cost.
Right.
There are many decisions that you can make early on in the design to, what's called design for operability, so that things are easy to access. So if you need to make a repair or you need to replace a part, it's easy to just pop open a panel and then work on it. But decision makers over and over again never want to make that choice because it costs a little bit more money up front.
Right.
You gotta do a little work on the design, and then there's a little more money typically to do it that way, because it can be cheaper to kind of kludge it together, so it's actually harder to pull it apart. So over and over again, they make the decision to save the money right now, but then it costs them later. A good example is the kill vehicle, which is a part of the missile defense system that is actually, so the way the missile defense works is through kinetic energy, which there is a rocket that launches, and then there's a payload on top of that that's called a kill vehicle. What that kill vehicle does, it separates. It's a small maneuverable vehicle that launches. It's the payload. It launches off of the booster, and then it flies around and tries to intercept an incoming reentry vehicle. So whether it's conventional or a nuclear payload, and just tries to hit it head on. And given how fast it's going, it would basically wipe it out by hitting it in space or in the atmosphere, and it would basically destroy it. The one of the systems, when the way that the way that it was built, and it was built in a hurry, so that was one of the issues, is how highly compressed schedule. Anytime that you needed to change out anything, the battery or anything, you had to take it completely apart because all of that stuff was right in the middle of it. So you had to completely disassemble it, take it apart, change something out, and then spend all this time putting it back together. It was just a big mess. So that's the most extreme example. Another example of that is the Ryan space capsule, which is part of the space launch system for NASA. It was not designed to be operable, sustainable. So they got to a certain point in one of the capsules, and they determined that that there's something that needed to be replaced. It was failing some sort of testing. So they had to take it all apart in order to get to the guts in order to change something out. So most of the times that's not the case. An example where there was a little bit of contingency in place that did pay off was in the Apollo program. Mm-hmm. So when they were designing the propulsion systems, the German rocket scientists that worked for Ron, they had, without consulting or without working with the designers of the structural elements in the Saturn V rockets, they had put some contingencies in place that made the rockets a little more powerful than they needed to be for the expected weight. And so when the engineers came to them, they said, "Hey guys, well, this is going to have to be a little heavier than we originally thought. Is that going to be a problem?" I said, "No worries. We had already put some margin in place because we were expecting you to deliver something that was heavier than what you had said. So our propulsion systems are powerful enough that they can handle the extra weight." So that's one case where contingencies actually were put in place and did work out and did save a lot of time and costs in terms of, because if it had been not been able to handle the extra weight, they would have had to go out and try to change materials. They would have had to try to change the design of the structures, or they might have had to redesign the propulsion elements to make them more powerful.
Oh, yeah, right. So it sounds like the NASA people had some insights that, I'm sure if they had all the budget that I think you and I think they ought to have, they could actually have some of these contingencies working to put into place so that we could have a way to defend the planet if a rock came this way, a big rock. And sure, it's a lot of money, but what's the cost of losing the planet, right? So
right. There's a lot of downside.
Yeah, there's a massive downside. So poor Bobby Axelrod is wondering, he's got billions in his pocket, but how many people really need to have a third business jet at $60 million? Well, it turns out he did. So he plunks the money down, and time goes by, and then all of a sudden, I need to be on this cargo plane that I can get past customs that's specially designed to has a container that's specially designed to smuggle somebody out, that we can rerun the whole thing. And he gets out. And it's a matter of aligning towards contingencies and what you're going to do in various capacities. So getting back to these limits that you see here, this Costa Concordia with the captain I was talking about, he was basically playing. He wanted to show off for girlfriends what the story was, so he wanted to go close to this island, and he got too close and he wrecked the boat. It cost 3 times the money in damages and salvage to the boat. Plus, they lost 32 people. 32 people died in this.
Right.
And in a business environment, the Ariane 2 was doing much the same thing. There's a limit that exists financially for a market, and they were trying to go beyond it, which is effectively like trying to go between the rocks near a shoreline, and so there's still water there. We're still good, but the market sets these limits that you can discover if you spend enough time to try to plot it all out. You can see these limits, and then you can work with these limits so that you can figure out what you can and can't do. Now, interestingly, I had a post I put up just yesterday that I discovered something that I didn't know if it would work, but I thought I'd try it. The stock market is one of the most complete data sets I've ever seen. I'm sure you would agree. You can get, if you go to the S&P 500, you can get all 500 stocks, their prices, their volume, their shares, and I think in the application I have, I could get 200 independent variables if I wanted to. Well, what's very interesting about that is that I wondered if the stock market might have itself a demand frontier. And so there's a little bit of a cheat here. If you take out Google and you take out Amazon, which are both in their own stratosphere, they are way beyond what the rest of the 500 do. But if you take the limit that applies to the other 500, you'll find that there's a nice frontier for the number of shares that are out there. And then very interestingly, the same companies that are on the frontier, so outfits like Facebook and Apple and Microsoft, the same outfits that are on frontier for the number of shares are also on the same frontier for the volume on a daily basis. And also very interesting is that the slope of the volume curve is within 4% of the slope for the overall frontier. So in one case, you're using, it's kind of funny to use numbers like this. You're using only $200 billion worth of volume to see if you can predict $35 trillion worth of value. And it turns out within, a range, you can do that. And so I hypothesized, well, what would happen if how would you manage to work out the demand frontier for, say, flat screen TVs? Now, in an ideal world, all the data would just fall into your lap and you'd have no problem. Or if you're working for some outfit, say like Best Buy, you could go and get all your receipts and see the quantity you had, the prices, and that frontier would become obvious to you. But what if you don't work at Best Buy or another big reseller or something like that? What do you do then? Well, my hypothesis was that the number of ratings that people have ought to be uniform throughout the distribution, which is to say the percentage of people that are reviewing the $10,000 sets is the same percentage that are reviewing the $1,000 sets that are reviewing the $400 sets. Now, I don't know that to be true. It'd be nice to see if there was some data that would quantify that one way or the other. But if you do make that supposition, that while there's going to be the same number of reviewers on a percentage basis, you don't want to get the intercept. What you want to get is the slope of this line. So if you take those points and you plot them, and at their edge, they form a demand frontier, which is statistically significant, which based on the work with the S&P 500, you kind of think, well, it should work for here. And by golly, it does work. So that's another way to work out a limit. And so the stuff that I do with respect to limits is not unlike your work in both risk and uncertainty. There's a risk for trying to exceed these limits.
Right.
There's a big risk for proposing that you're going to do something. In the case of business aircraft, that market's been there for 50 years or more. You to suppose you're going to exceed it, you would have to say that you've got data that shows that the demand curve is shifting your way in a way in which it supports your proposed outcome. And it turned out that it didn't. So in the military environment, the demand curve for fighter, bomber, and attack aircraft is much the same. Now, it's changed 2% in 25 years. So I can tell you right now, ladies and gentlemen, I hope I'm around to see it, but the Northrop company is supposing that they're going to make 100 B-21 bombers at $600 million a piece in 2016 dollars. And there's a chance they can do that, but that chance, according to me, is less than 1 in a million. That's because they're so far beyond the curve, and the curve is very highly correlated at the limit. So it turns out to be stuff that's useful in your day-to-day that you could work with. Now, one of the questions, I think that happens to business owners is likelihood of an occurrence versus outcome. The whole idea about insurance is, the basic types of insurance. So one insurance type that we have now that we didn't have 20 years ago is cyber attack insurance. I've got ourselves a cyber policy, but how much do you set yourself up for liability on something like that? And how do you assess the risk? I mean, we've seen some pretty big infiltrations in the cyber world here. I have a couple in mind. What are your favorite ones to study that you like?
Cyber attacks. I don't know. I don't have any off the top of my head. But what are you thinking about?
Well, I saw this whole series. Well, series. It was I think it was a documentary on the Stuxnet, or I think it's Stuxnet. That was it was some software that we don't know who exactly wrote it, but it's rumored that the United States and maybe this country called Israel might have combined to create some software that might have got into some Iranian nuclear facility. And what they did, what's alleged is that this went in and started to work on and against the digital controllers that they had. So the controllers are supposed to spin, this in a nuclear enrichment plant. They have lots of centrifuges at work to spin out the good stuff and leave behind the bad. So they had a bunch of centrifuges at work, and they're supposed to go at a certain rate. And the software managed to confuse these centrifuges, so if they thought they were going at a certain rate, then they would speed them up to 50 times what they should have been, or drop their speed to a fraction what it should be. And the next thing you know, the whole thing broke itself apart. And so I think the example that we saw in the United States recently was, just last week, or just this week, actually, Facebook/Instagram had some major shutdowns, and they still haven't told anybody what happened. No. And you would think a company like that has got just massive cyber protection on it, but still it was hacked. I'm astonished at the level to which somebody might go to do something like that. I couldn't imagine it would be an internal problem, and they haven't really copped to what happened. But what's your feeling about what you have to do and what you can do in a situation like that?
Oh, well, I mean, you got to, it's going to be some challenges with that because it's always changing. Mm-hmm. Systems are always changing, and techniques are always changing. But trying to keep things secure is very important. And cyber is a big risk right now.
Yeah. I've been. I mean, of course, we thought there might have been some hacking in some of the past elections here too. So there was a whole documentary on how easy the voting machines are to hack and the risk.
Yes, 11 and 12-year-old children have been hacking them, right? In some cases.
That's mind-boggling. So.
These things aren't even connected to the internet. There's no need for these systems to be connected to the internet. We should be using paper ballots. We can use electronic voting machines or electronic counting, but being able to access them from the internet, it shouldn't happen.
Well, what's interesting is when they're showing these voting machines that shouldn't be connected to the internet, it turns out that they had anywhere from 1 to 6 ports that clever people could use to connect it to the internet,
right.
Or to take on a virus, something as simple as a thumb drive.
Yeah.
I think this is a case in which going back to a pre-tech condition, paper ballots, right? I mean, you just have mounds of paper.
Yeah.
And now, interestingly, to talk about that is recently here we had a recall election, and a friend of mine said, well, she said, well, I'm not going to mail in my recall ballot. I'm going to go in person. I said, oh, okay. Well, you see, there's a vote's a vote. She goes, no, 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 no. You don't want to mail it. I said, well, why is that? Well, there's a hole on the envelope, which when I got my ballot, I looked, and sure enough, there's a hole in the envelope, basically I thought to let somebody know there was a piece of paper in there that you might want to count, right? Rather than it being open. There's a whole front and back so you can see if there's something in some contents to this envelope. And I said, well, what's the problem with the hole? And she said, well, if the ballot's placed in a certain way, through that hole, you can tell who they voted for, and they're going to throw out the ballots that they don't like. And I said, okay. And so I tried to replicate this.
Yeah.
I couldn't replicate it, but this is, and I don't know how we get back to a place in which we can engender trust in the system. I mean, a good hunk of what it is that you do when you get to risk is when you're trying to reduce the risk. As you're reducing risk, you're actually engendering trust. I would argue they're inverse relationships. The less risk you encounter, the more trust you have in the system. I mean, that's kind of that's how I see it with what it is that you're doing, and that's why I'm so excited about it. Maybe you can elaborate a little bit more on that.
Oh, sure. Yeah, the less, for example, you're crossing a bridge, the less risk there is, the more trust you place in crossing it, right? Without falling down. Yeah,
and speaking of bridges, I mean, right now the infrastructure in the United States is in drastic need of repair, and your risk analysis could, combined with structural analysis, could help us determine where the biggest impacts would be for putting positive change into the world right now.
What are the biggest priorities for fixing those things? We've spent trillions of dollars in overseas wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, which we recently pulled out of. And I mean, if we spent a relatively small fraction on infrastructure, it could have been a big benefit to the United States.
Yes, exactly. So who's your next conference going to be with?
I'm part of, there's a online conference next week. It's called Risk Awareness Week.
Oh, okay.
So you look for it on LinkedIn. It's pretty heavily promoted on there, but look up or Google Risk Awareness Week. Alexei Sidorenko, I think, is the host for that. And they expect over 5,000 people to.
Oh, wow.
So I've recorded my presentation. It's going to be available for viewing next week.
Oh, great.
It's about it's a case study of an estimate I did for NASA about 12 years ago on integrated cost and schedule risk for a planetary mission called MAVEN.
Great.
We always say when we do estimates, you and I are longtime estimators, that you never really get an estimate truly right. So that's the reason why I put uncertainty around it, is because we can't always hit the bullseye. It's very hard to do looking years in the future, but this is one case where I did hit a bullseye. I've got a couple of cases where I've hit a bullseye in an estimate. One was estimating the birth weight of my son. My wife and I kind of both had guesses as to how much he would weigh, and I hit it right on the to the ounce, basically.
Wow.
I used a combination of the idea of his weight would be similar to mine, but my weight was above average. I was 8.5 pounds at birth. So and there typically is a regression to the mean in terms of size,
yes, right,
and weights. And so I figured there'd be a regression to the mean. So he would be closer to the average. So I reckon he would be 8 pounds, 2 ounces. And that's exactly what it was. So,
wow. Well, interestingly, the regression to the mean was one of the first ideas of regression, right? That's
that is where the term regression comes from. So Francis Galton came up with the idea in looking at the heights of fathers and sons, and so the term regression was a coin for regression to the mean. Mm-hmm. So he looked at that and did some analysis and found that they were highly correlated. Heights of sons and fathers were highly correlated, but that fathers that are above average would tend to have sons that were closer to the average, and fathers that were below average in height would have sons that were closer to the average. So that was one case where I got that right. The This other case, which happened before my son was born in 2017, this was in 2009. I did an estimate for NASA, and I did an integrated cost and schedule risk analysis for a planetary spacecraft called Maven. And my estimates for the 50th for cost and for schedule were within 1% of the actuals.
Wow.
And I think that part of that, I think there's been utility definitely in doing the analysis jointly. I think you do more accurate estimates because the two things do depend on each other. As the old saying goes, time is money. So I'll talk about that estimate and how it was done. And there's also a free giveaway for a tool that you can use to do these kinds of analyses at a very high level. And one of the things that I did with this analysis was I did it at a very high level, used something called parametrics that we're both familiar with, where we look at historical past trends, and we look at the overall gross characterization of the system. And in general, I think that those kinds of estimates tend to be more objective. And they're often, when you look at risk analysis, the risk analysis was based on looking at that past historical variation. Those risk analyses capture more of the uncertainty than just looking, trying to identify the risk discretely.
Good point. Now, are you going to make a presentation at next year's ICEA conference?
I need to. I haven't an abstract yet. Are you going to present?
I just came up with the title of my abstract today. What am I calling it? I am calling it 8D Cost Trades with Entanglement. That's what I'm calling it.
Oh, cool.
So those of you who follow my work know that I see markets originally start out in 4 dimensions. You add another market to it because they have a common price axis. You end up with 4 dimensions plus another 3. You get a 7-dimension view. But when you add time, you get the 8th dimension where Buckaroo Banzai lives. And we're going to do an analysis of cost entanglement. So what that means in layman's terms is, for example, that most aircraft today have a large component. A large component of the aircraft is actually purchased by the airframer to be part of the subcomponents that they assemble. So, for example, Boeing doesn't make jet engines. They buy them from GE or they buy them from Rolls-Royce. And the point I'll make here is that if GE or Rolls-Royce were to have their prices be unreasonably high or not demonstrate sufficient learning, it would actually impact their ability to their client's ability to sell the aircraft, and in turn impact the ability for the engine manufacturer to make profits on their engines. And so we're going to look at how these things interweave with one another and what it means to have something that's highly entangled like that, because it works out that most things are entangled if they're complicated enough. Once you get past raw materials, you start to get entanglement. So we're going to talk about that. So Christian, I see your book over your shoulder. Maybe you could tell us one more time about your book.
Oh, yeah.
Tell us about the audio copy there.
Yeah, so Solving for Project Risk Management. It's available through Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and other sellers. There's an ebook version available for the Kindle and for the Nook. And most recently, in September, an audio version came out. And so that's available through audiobooks.com and also Audible. If you're an Audible subscriber, I believe you can get it for the audio version for less than $8 right now.
Wow, that's great. And you didn't get a chance to record that. They had somebody that does that for a living, I guess, right?
Yes, Barry Abrams, who narrates quite a few audiobooks. He works for recorded books, and his I'm not sure this is a side gig of his. He is a behind-the-scenes producer on ESPN as well.
Oh, cool.
So he also does audiobook narrations. So it was pretty much transparent to me. They just said that they were going to do an audio version, and next thing I know, the audio version came out. So
that's great. Well, congratulations, Christian. And again, ladies and gentlemen, I suggest you pick that copy up. I've enjoyed mine tremendously.
Smart Remarks, Howard States, has been brought to you by Multidimensional Economic Evaluators. If you have any questions or comments, please email us at info@meevaluators.com. For more information on Christian, please visit his website, christianbesmart.com. And for more information on Doug, see his LinkedIn page, Douglas Howarth, or his website, doughowarth.com. Thanks for listening, and until next time, keep reaching for the right answer.